Okay, good morning, everybody. Good day, everybody. Today, we will have the second webinar by the Commission on Volcanogenic Sediments. This day, we have Shannon Frey that will talk about extreme variability in sedimentary structures shaped by the interacting deep water ocean currents and seamounts. So please, Shannon.
Okay, great. Thanks, Andrea. Hopefully everyone can hear me. So yes, today I'll be giving a slightly longer version of a presentation that I gave a couple months ago at the IAS conference in Aberdeen. And it's discussing the results from the first project in my PhD, which looked at sedimentary structures on the seafloor around the Havre Volcano. And what we saw there was, as the title says, extreme variability in these sediments. And this extreme variability arises where we have deep ocean currents that interact with seafloor topography, in this case, a seamount. And so when we think about, sorry, let me make sure, there we go. When we think about deep ocean sedimentation, we can sort of very roughly break it into these three dominant end members. So we have pelagic settling, there's contourite deposition, so from bottom currents, and then we also have density current depositions creating turbidites. And there's a slightly different way that we could conceptualize this. So we could say that where we have pelagic settling, the environment is quite calm, and where we have contourite deposition, it's a lot more static, or we have a persistent bottom current. And then where we have density currents, it's more episodic deposition. And we could also characterize this in terms of the relation of these events to the continental slope. So we could say that where we have, again, pelagic settling, it's a little more away or an open environment. And where we have contourite deposition, it's a long slope. And then where we have density current deposition, it's downslope. And what I'm going to suggest today is that we need to sort of expand these three members to include a fourth environment, and that is what we call the dynamic environment. And this dynamic environment arises where, again, ocean currents, in this case, deep ocean currents, interact with some kind of topography. And this could be, primarily moderate to large scale topography, but this could be anything like reefs or a cliff. Most often in oceanographic settings, it's they deal with seamounts, and so that's how it's depicted here. So currents interacting with a seamount. And this shouldn't be really too crazy of an idea, this dynamic environment, because we all have a very basic understanding of fluid dynamics, and we all know that when a current interacts with an obstacle, it creates complex flow patterns in the wake of an obstacle. And this is something that oceanographers have actually been onto for a very long time. They're very aware of the sort of complexity that arises around seamounts. You can have lots of different types of factors involved with flow. So you can have things like internal turbulence, local turbulence, internal waves. You can generate eddying around a seamount, Taylor caps, vertical circulation cells. So there is quite a lot of variability going on just from the effects of flow, but also things like geographic location, again, tides in the area. So lots of different effects sort of combining together to create, again, a complex environment around the seamount. And, why is this significant? Well, if we look at a map of global distribution of seamounts, this is from Wessel 2001, and we have large, intermediate, and small seamounts here on this map. We can see that the global seafloor is, in fact, littered with seamounts. They are everywhere. And so this dynamic environment is really something that we should be expecting to arise a lot more often than we, currently think about it, which is really not at all. And if this Wessel estimate is actually old, so if we look at another map, so there's a lot going on here, but we'll walk through it. So this is the bottom layer here is benthic current velocity. So current velocity on the seafloor with a scale here for speed. And we can see that current velocity ranges from about 0, which is kind of what we expect, but all the way up to about 1 meter per second, so actually quite fast on the seafloor. And then what we have as a sort of overlay, so all these white dots are actually also seamounts. So this is a more recent update from I think it's Gregorian 2023. So every white dot is a seamount, and even this estimate is considered to be an underestimate of the global seamounts. It is likely to be higher than that. And then in the pink dots, we have shallow seamounts. So these are seamounts that have a base depth of 3 kilometers or shallower. So these are the ones that are more likely to be experiencing some kind of current interaction. But then we also have, reefs and microcontinents as examples to really demonstrate that this should really be more of a global phenomenon than we're currently thinking. So this brings us to Havre, which is a subaqueous volcano in the Kermadec Arc. And in 2012, it was the source of the then largest deep ocean silicic volcanic eruption. And it generated a lot of volcanic products that it dispersed into the sea around the volcano, including this pumice raft, as well as a pumice raft here, as well as these large blocks that it kind of littered the seafloor with around the volcano. But then also this ash and lapilli cover, which essentially mantled the topography around the volcano. And it's this ash and lapilli cover that we're going to be looking at. So there were 2 voyages to Havre following the 2012 eruption. There was MESH in 2015 and VULCA in 2022. And MESH used the ROV Jason and the AUV Sentry to collect data from around the volcano. So the ROV Jason remote operated vehicle was able to kind of go wherever it wanted. So these are the Jason tracks here in the dots. And Jason collected video footage as well as some samples of the seafloor. And then the AUV Sentry was used to map the volcano, the caldera. So this is a 1 meter resolution BEM here in orange around the caldera. And then VULCA in 2022 used a deep tow camera to collect, again, video footage along these sort of radiating transect lines away from the volcano. So in total, there was about 400 hours of video footage to analyze. And when Martin conceived of this project and when he and I were originally discussing it before we ever saw any of the video footage, we were very much coming at this from a sort of deep water sedimentological perspective. We were expecting to see a quiet environment with very few ripples, if any. And we assumed that the ripples we saw would be indicative of the sort of overarching current flow. And we would be able to say, oh, this is what the current is doing around the volcano and sort of call it a day. But what we saw on the seafloor was actually much, much more complex than that. So I really do mean when I say extreme variability, and we're going to look at some examples shortly. But just to sort of help orient ourselves, this is a bedform diagram from Stowe et al. May not be the best application here, but it's going to help us sort of get an idea of what we're looking at on the seafloor. So we saw a range of bedforms kind of within this box. So everything, kind of every ripple morphology, as well as sand ribbons, sand furrows, dunes, but then we also saw these optical comet scours sort of features. So quite a range of bedforms, but spanning quite a range of flow velocity as well. So 0.1 meters per second to 1 meter per second. So that's quite a wide range of variation for the study area. But we didn't just see this kind of over the entire study area. We saw it over very short distances as well. So what we're going to do is actually look at the very start of Deep Tow Camera Transect 4. We're going to look at about 300 meters of this transect. And I'm going to show you video footage from the transect, and we'll pause the video as we go through it and sort of analyze the ripples as we see them, and try and get a sense of what's going on the seafloor. And hopefully the videos all work through all our various internet connections. And also, I do have to say, if you're unfamiliar with deep tow camera footage, it can be a little jarring. So I apologize if it makes anyone feel a little seasick or something like that. But hopefully after a couple minutes, we'll all feel a little more comfortable. So here we go. This is the seafloor around Havre. We can see that ash and lapilli cover. And we also have, these are older blocks here. We know that they're older because they are colonized by corals. But we can see that that ash and lapilli cover is quite extensively rippled. And we'll just sort of advance a little bit and then pause the video here. So there is a scale here. It's very hard to see. There are these two tiny white dots, but those are 30 centimeters apart. So they'll help us orient ourselves here. And with the deep tow camera and the lighting of it, it was occasionally hard to determine, what orientation the ripples had. But oftentimes the camera would kind of like rotate as it bounced along the seafloor, and you would get different perspectives on the ripples. So that did help us sort of determine what orientation we were looking at. In this case, I would say that the dark side of the ripples is the south and the light side is the lee. And so current direction is traveling towards us, the viewer. And we also have a little inset map down here in the bottom right to help us sort of keep ourselves oriented as we progress through this transect. So if we continue on, so again, just moving from our previous location forward, we can see, again, more colonization on these old blocks. So these are quite old, much prior to the 2012 eruption. We're starting to see some scouring around these older blocks as well. But again, the seafloor is still rippled, and occasionally we do see evidence of life, and in some cases, some bioturbation on the sea surface. If we pause the video again, so we'll just bring back our scale and our inset map. Now, again, I would say that the dark side of the ripples is still the south, and the light side is still the lee. But we can see that current direction has changed a little bit. It is now traveling a little more left to right instead of just straight at the viewer. All right, we'll keep going. So we'll travel a little more forward, but already we see a change on the seafloor. The ripples are different or potentially gone. Originally, we were seeing much more sort of sinuous crested or even potentially arcuate ripples, and then linear ripples, and now they're a little absent. We're seeing a little more scouring around these larger clasts. And then we're just going to travel a little more forward. There was another excellent scour. And we're going to come up around this very large block here. And then the camera's going to swing down, and there's something else weird there on the seafloor. So this looks to me, I'll bring the scale back, kind of like a confluence of currents, potentially directed by these very large blocks here. So we've got a little bit of swirling happening on the seafloor here, and that's expressed in ripples. But if we progress even just slightly further from here, we're going to drop down a little closer to the seafloor, and we'll get a little better idea of what's going on. But we'll see once we get closer. So now we're no longer in a rippled regime. Now we're in sand ribbons. And we also, again, have these scours here. And often when we would see scours and sort of features in the ash and lapilli cover together, so whether they were ripples or sand ribbons like this, they were rarely in agreement with each other. But here, I would argue that they are, and so we can use the scour feature to help us determine what direction the current is flowing. And we can say that we've got erosion on the side close to us and deposition on the side away. And so now current direction is traveling away from the viewer. And again, our little inset map here is updating with our current directions as we go on. So we've gone 100 meters about, and we've seen a lot of change already. So we're going to skip a little section of video. It's essentially the sand ribbons continue and then disappear. And we're just going to hop ahead a little further down section here to another point. So the sand ribbons do disappear, and then we have a sort of featureless ash and lapilli cover, but we still have these very strong, pronounced scours, these common scours that let us determine the orientation of the current. So again, erosion close to us and deposition away. So the current direction is still traveling away from the viewer. And we'll advance a little further from here. So the ash lapilli cover is still featureless, but if we let the video play a little bit longer, we're going to come up to another one of those large blocks. This one is very well colonized by coral. And as we come over this large block, we'll see that there are, again, ripples, but we'll let the video play a little longer. So we have one set of ripples kind of coming into view here on the right. But as the camera drops down, we start to see that there's actually two sets of ripples on the seafloor, and they have conflicting orientations. They're at about 90 degrees to each other. So we'll bring back again the inset and scale, and we'll say here, to me, the ripples on the right side of the frame are kind of traveling right to left, and then the ripples on the left side of the frame are traveling now back towards the viewer again. So that's the end of our video journey, our 300-meter transect. And if we look at what we saw on that transect a little closer up, we can see that in just that 300-meter span, we saw two 180-degree reversals in current direction. We saw 4 different types of bed forms, probably more, both erosional and depositional regimes, sometimes at the same location. And we also saw conflicting indicators at 2 locations. So we had that location where it was swirling, and then we also had the location where they were 90 degrees to each other. So again, this is what we mean when we say extreme variability. It's really in that 300 meters, we saw all of these changes. And if we go back to that bedform diagram from Stowe, we can really say, in that 300 meters, we saw almost all of these bedforms, just in this box here. So not just over the entire study area, we saw these bedforms, but we saw them over very concentrated, very short distances. So again, we saw different ripple morphologies, we saw the sand ribbons, and we saw these scours. And not just that, but significant flow velocity variation over short distances as well. So we have extreme variability spatially in ripples, but we also felt like we saw evidence for variability in the temporal fluctuations of the currents in the area. So we'll show one more video here. It does make a horrible screeching noise every time I play it, so I'll turn the volume down. This is from Jason, and the resolution is quite bad. I apologize for that. Hopefully you'll see at least vaguely what I'm talking about here. So this is Jason looking down on the seafloor, and he's sort of rotating over a patch of that ash and lapilli cover. And if we stop the video, I did try to enhance it a little bit, so it might be a little clearer now. But what I see here, or what I saw in the higher resolution footage that we have, is what looks to me like ripples here. So I'll do that again. So there's some ripples there. And then we also have sand ribbons here. So again, these linear features here. And then there's also a comet scour down here. And to me, what I felt like I was seeing here was ripples that had been forming under a current that was flowing right to left, but then current direction switched and started flowing left to right. And those ripples were then cannibalized into these long sand ribbons that we're seeing. So important to remember that this footage is from Jason, which means it was taken about 3 years following the eruption. So we can say, at least very roughly, within a 3-year time span, we saw current reversals happening. And we can also say that within the 3-year time span following the eruption, it does appear that remobilization of the sediment is very strong, very intense on the seafloor. There are a couple more examples here from deep tow camera footage of where we had sort of ripples and scours at the same locations and, vaguely active at the same time. So we'll just have a look. We've got ripples here in both images. They're both kind of sort of directed towards the viewer. And then we also have the scour features. On the left-hand side, the ripples and the scours are a little more at 180 degrees to each other, whereas on the right-hand side, they're a little more 90 degrees to each other. And on the left, it does appear like we might be in a bit more of a depositional regime. The ripple seem maybe a little more active, and the scour is kind of slightly infilled, but hard to say from just a snapshot. And on the right, the erosional regime might be slightly more active. We can see the scours are maybe a little more pronounced, maybe some substrate here below these larger clasts, and the ripples do kind of appear to be sort of being pulled in the orientation of the scour. But again, both these features seem to be roughly active around the same time, but also at the very least active within, so these are from the deep tow camera, so that would be within 10 years of the eruption. So quite fast reworking of sediments, and also, as I was saying, quite fast sort of fluctuations of the currents over short time spans. So if we look at the whole data set together, so collected orientations from every ripple that I saw on the seafloor, as well as all the scours. We also took observations from fish where we could see them sort of swimming against the current. Also things like particle drift, but it's harder to see those on this map. So we'll focus on the ripples and the scours. We can see from ripple orientation that it is essentially all over the place. There's no real organization here. We can't make any sort of conclusions about what the predominant current flow is from the ripples. The scours do seem to suggest that they're indicative of a little more persistent flow in the area, so that is a little interesting. There is still quite a bit of variability, although there just seem to be sort of strong trends, sort of vaguely east-west, although there is also this sort of, again, vaguely north-south spike here. And so from the scours, we're able to make some very rough interpretations. If we look at just the scours, we can see that primarily the scours are kind of deflecting or being driven away from the topographic high, from the caldera, so just sort of being deflected down and away. But in particular, we can see, so these two features down here are lava domes, and we can see that there's actually quite significant sort of swirling that occurs around these lava domes. So we also saw some features on the 1 meter DEM and some other interesting features that are worth mentioning. So on the 1 meter DEM, we saw these quite pronounced linear features just to the west of the caldera here. And these are deep scours. They're about 100 meters long. And then on the bottom here, we have these dunes that occurred at the end of Deep Toe Camera Transect 4. And both of these occur in areas where the slope is quite steep. So up top here, this is actually about a 30-degree slope. And down here, it's about 18 degrees, so quite steep. And what we interpret this as being is acceleration of currents down these steeper slopes. There was also a core that was collected, core GC10, which is this location here. So again, just at the end of Deep Toe Camera Transect 4. And if we were to sort of look at this core, if we sort of take a step back from Havre, and if we had just sort of pulled this core off a shelf and we're looking at it from a deep marine sedimentation perspective, it's very likely that we would interpret, we've got two normally graded sands here, that we would interpret these as turbidite deposits. But in the context of what we saw around Havre from the video footage and the proximity of GC10 to Deep Toe Camera Transect 4, we're much more likely now to call these sands reworked than we would, or remobilized than we would turbidite. So we have quite a lot of sedimentological data. We wanted to supplement that with some oceanographic data. So we collected some data from Argo floats. And if you're unfamiliar with what an Argo float is, it's an oceanographic instrument that is essentially dropped off a ship, descends to about 1,000 meters water depth, which is roughly the same water depth as we're looking at around Havre. And then it descends further, it drifts at 1,000 meters for 10 days, collects data, and then drops down even further, ascends back to the surface and transmits the data for collection. So we were able to get Argo float data for the area around Havre for about a 10-year period, including the 2012 event. And there wasn't a lot of data. There wasn't enough to do statistical analysis of it in any way to try and determine if there were seasonal trends or seasonal variations. But what we can see in the currents at 1,000 meters water depth around the volcano, there is still significant variability. So this seems to be supporting what we see in the sediments. So we have this large eddy here to the west, and then also, very interestingly, these north-south current reversals also to the west of the volcano. And then it looks more to the east, a little weaker currents, but still essentially variable, essentially sort of no coherence to them. So this data supports what we were seeing in the sediments. And again, if we step back even further and just think about Havre's location in the Kermadec sort of arc, or in the trough is actually where it is. So here we have the arc, and Havre is here in yellow, and it actually sits just off the arc, a little bit inside this sort of trough area, which may explain why we've got those north-south directed currents in the area. That may be currents traveling up and down the trough. It does not explain the reversals in the currents, but it does explain their orientation. And then if we step back and also look at the surface currents around Havre, so it's an approximate location here, we can see there's quite a bit of variability just in the surface of ocean circulation in the area as well. And there has been some work to show that a lot of this does extend to depth. So when we think about all of these factors sort of together, so we think about sort of larger scale circulation, across sort of latitudinal, longitudinal lines, but then also circulation just more, closed in around the volcano, but then also all the sort of topographic factors that we were seeing, you get, again, this really sort of complex, nuanced environment. And yes, so again, just want to bring back this image here from sort of an oceanography perspective, where we're dealing with not just sort of larger scale circulation patterns, but we're also dealing with things like turbulence, internal waves, eddying, Taylor caps, vertical circulating cells, right? So again, there's a lot of factors going on here. And we've kind of tried to summarize this in a figure. So we've sort of excluded larger scale circulation from this, but we have included, again, some of those oceanographic features like the turbulence, internal waves, circulating cells, but then also the variability on the impinging current. So this is kind of taken from our Argo float data, where we have those north-south switches. And there's also been shown to be quite a lot of eddying that extends to depth around the Kermadec. So it's also possible that we're seeing larger scale eddying happening in the area. But then we also have deflections in the currents that arise from topographic interactions. So things like the current deflecting around the seamount as an entire body, which might produce eddying as well, but also deflections around these smaller scale features like the lava domes. But we also have channelizing of the current. We also have deflection of the current as slope changes. And then we also have current acceleration downslope. So all these other factors that are driving the variability that we're seeing. And so we've also tried to capture that here with another figure, just showing again that this happens or can happen quite quickly, and just sort of demonstrating how this sort of variability affects the seafloor. So we have, older currents and more active currents, and these currents are kind of at a finer scale steered by the topography that they encounter. So around class or around large, or I guess like things like lava domes. But then occasionally, depending on the direction of the impinging flow, this might be different, and we might see things where actually current appears to travel upslope. We did see some evidence for things like that in our video footage. So again, just sort of trying to demonstrate the complexity of the environment. And because of this, because this is sort of relatively new, this dynamic environment is not something that gets discussed that often, and because of the potential global distribution that we saw from our seamounts map, we are proposing a new Facies model for this environment, which we call deep marine tractional sands. And some characteristics of this Facies model are that you're going to have variable bioturbation because the energy of the system will vary depending on what the currents are doing at one specific location. The grain size will range from silt to pebbles. There will be the entire facies may occur as small isolated lenses or maybe larger kilometer scale beds. There were beds of ripples that were quite extensive on the seafloor from what we could see. We'll also see that ripples will vary in size and shape and will indicate diverging flow directions. And also scours and ripples will be interbedded. So essentially, there will be no pattern to this. It will be somewhat chaos, and it will really just depend on local effects on the seafloor. There is also implications here for a biological perspective. We've discussed that in our upcoming paper, but also please feel free to ask questions about that later. And so if we think about the implications of this, if we again go back to the data set and we think about more sort of traditional sedimentological data collection, things like cores or outcrops, and we think about trying to core off a ship in a location like this, you know, you might get a few cores. You might get a few samples from this whole data set. So a couple snapshots of the ripples, and maybe you can pull a scour orientation from a core. But the problem with this is that if we step back, even with all this data, even with the Argo float data, even with quite detailed numerical modeling that's been done of circulation in the Kermadex, I could still not tell you what the main hydrodynamic forces were that were acting in this area. I could still not predict what was going to happen next, or try and predict, you know, where the main sediment movement was from this data set. Maybe I could hazard a guess with the scours, but that's certainly going to be very interpretive and is still quite open to question with these sort of fluctuations here. So even with all that data, I could still not make an accurate interpretation. So trying to do that from core, or trying to do that from, say, outcrop, similar problem, where you're only getting really sparse data and you don't really have a good sort of overview of the system. And the other problem here is that you would kind of need to know, if you saw sort of ripples in outcrop here like this, how would you know if there was effective topography in the area? So say within a 1 kilometer, 5 kilometer, 10 kilometer radius around this patch of ripples that you're seeing. It would be very difficult for you to ascertain if there was some sort of, you know, escarpment, or again, a seamount, or even just a very large boulder or something that happened to be on the seafloor that might be affecting current flow, that might make your interpretations slightly different. And it's also important to consider that things like seamounts grow quite quickly over depositional timescales, at least. Same with reefs. So this also poses a challenge for interpretations from the ancients. And there's an additional challenge here, that oftentimes when we're making these interpretations, again, from core or from outcrop, we're often thinking about it in terms of this sort of classical perspective, where we're thinking that ripples occur either from contrarite deposition or density current deposition, which are trapped in this sort of along slope or down slope perspective. And the ripples that we saw around Havre were essentially neither of those, and they were, again, quite chaotic and very much dependent on the local topography. And sort of staying trapped in this thinking is what is going to create problems. And that is, again, why we're proposing this dynamic environment. And just as a quite quick example of that, from a deep tow camera, so there's a very clear slope here, traveling left, or the slope is descending left to right, and we've got ripples on this slope that are traveling what appear to be towards the viewer, so not downslope at all. And then there are additional implications here when we think about collecting samples from events. So we think about an event like the Tonga eruption. The event happens, and then a researcher or many researchers decide they want to go do some sampling. So they submit a grant application. The grant application needs to be approved. They get the funding, then they have to do a voyage application to get the sea time to collect the samples. And the voyage has to be scheduled, and you have to get the materials and the people. And so, you know, kind of best case scenario, the mesh expedition was quite fast. There's other voyages going to Tonga in the near future. So about a 3-year turnaround is fast for getting a voyage to a location to do some sampling. But even at Havre, it was very clear that within that 3 years, there's significant remobilization that is occurring. And the sediments are being reworked, if not once by a current, but potentially twice by different currents. And my intuition says probably way more frequently than that. So when we think about collecting samples for doing calculations of things like eruption magnitude or intensity, dating the samples, or trying to ascertain, you know, geochemical changes as the eruption continued, it's going to be very challenging, if not impossible, if the sediments have been significantly reworked, which it also seems is quite likely in environments like this. So that's really an important thing to keep in mind, again, when we're talking about this sort of dynamic environment. And so hopefully I haven't scared you all too much, but that is the end, and please feel free to ask questions.
So thank you, Shannon. Presentation was very interesting. If there are any questions, if you want to make question, please write down in the chat. Well, I would like to start to make you a question. Maybe it's quite strange little bit, but as I generally work on provenance, so how far do you think that those currents can transport sediments? I mean, you show us that those currents are really important in the sea, on the seabed, on the seafloor. So I can imagine that if I found somewhere a volcanic particle, would be quite impossible to understand from where this particle could come, right?
I think that's correct, yes. I mean, particularly in the case of volcanic particles that are more susceptible to reworking than traditional soloclastics. And as long as there's even sort of a moderate is a very broad term, but moderate current acting, you're likely to see it be transported quite far. And in particular, an environment like the Kermadex, where you're likely to have quite a bit of current sort of flowing north-south in this trough, or a lot of deflection occurring because of this sort of overarching topography. Yeah, I think that particle could go a long way.
Okay, so we will lose the signal of this particle. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience? Oh, there is a message here. Let's see. Thanks, Shannon. Judy Fox. What types of ideal data set do you think would help to understand these processes more?
Yes, great question, and something that I dream of sometimes. I would really love to be able to deploy like current sensors down in a setting like this. I'm not sure if it's even possible, but that is really the data set that you're looking for. You would need a high resolution deployment of acoustic Doppler meters, and you'd need them sensing in real time to see what the currents were doing. I don't think you could do it from a sedimentological perspective, not without, I guess, sort of continuous monitoring. That would be the alternative.
Okay, thank you. Any other question from the audience? While waiting, I saw that you show us a different course. Do you had any mixing already in the primary volcaniclastic stuff in terms of composition? I mean, do you found something that is not volcanic, maybe because was transported just after the accumulation of this stuff?
Not volcanic, no. We didn't see any non-volcanic particles, but it is important to remember that the setting we're in, extremely volcanically active, and there's a lot of different multiple source inputs in the area. So your most likely sediment source, there's very few islands or anything like that. So your dominant set of sources is volcanics. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about some carbonate, something like this, some stuff maybe floating in the sea. Okay. Okay, thank you. Well, I think that if there are no more questions, we can. I thank you again, Shannon, for your presentation. It was very, very interesting. I hope that you enjoy the webinar, and I would like you to invite to the third webinar that will be held on the 27th of. Oh, someone is taping. On the 27th of September at 3 p.m. Geneva Geneva time, so Central European time. The webinar will be on this life cycle of volcanic ash, deciphering deposits and field observation by Lucia Dominguez. For all the people that are arriving late, I'm sorry if the web link did not work properly, but we will upload the presentation. It is being recorded on our YouTube channel. So we have a YouTube channel, and I want to remind you all our social media, Instagram, X, Blue Sky, which is a social media that I never heard before. So I'm getting older, and then we have Facebook and LinkedIn too. So the link for the next webinar will come soon on our social media, and keep you in touch again. Thanks a lot again, Shannon, and see you soon. Bye bye.